Alright guys, so we're on part 3 now of our lecture on the coelomate invertebrates, and this is the big one. This is the arthropods. So, to be honest, we're going to be on this for probably 2 to 3 videos alone. By the time we get through the myriapods, crustaceans, chelicerates, and insects, it's a bunch. So, interesting group, but a big group, as we're going to see. So, in terms of sheer number of species of organisms, the phylum Arthropoda is by far the biggest. There are, in total, on planet Earth right now, there are around 2 million total described species. Of those, around 1.25 million, or 1,250,000 of them, are arthropods. Most of those, of course, are insects. So, by far, one of the biggest groups. They affect everything we do in both positive and negative ways, as we'll see. We're not going to get too far into that because we could go on about that for days, but be well aware that insects especially, but arthropods in general, affect our lives in lots and lots of ways. Like I mentioned, there are 4 classes. There are myriapods, chelicerates, crustaceans, and insects, and we're going to go into a little bit of detail and just barely scratch the surface on all of those. So in terms of the arthropods being a successful group, whenever you see a group that is far and away where there isn't even a close second in terms of number of species, you should always ask yourself why that is. Whenever there's an outlier anywhere in science, that's a really obvious place for a scientist to ask why. And so there's a lot of reasons, it turns out. Arthropods in particular are successful because they have jointed appendages. The name arthropod literally means jointed foot, although it really is, the spirit of it is getting at jointed legs is kind of the hallmark feature of this group. Those jointed legs make them very, very stable on uneven terrain, very adaptable in terms of different kinds of movements. And so that's one of the really big reasons why they've been such a successful group. Their exoskeleton is also very adaptable, very protective. It's not without its limitations, though, as we're going to see. There are some downsides to having an exoskeleton, and perhaps one of the biggest reasons why insects aren't any larger than they are, and really any arthropod, you can kind of use the same approach here. One of the big reasons why they don't get bigger than they do is because the exoskeleton limits their growth. There is a huge amount of protection by having an exoskeleton outside the body that protects all the soft bits within. So that's a big advantage as well. We've talked about hydrostatic skeletons so far. We're doing exoskeletons now, and eventually we'll talk about endoskeletons. But the biggest advantage of an exoskeleton compared to the other two is the fact that it's very, very protective. It also gives a good place for muscles to attach, as does an endoskeleton. In this case, the muscles attach to the inside of the exoskeleton. Which again is an advantage in one way, but actually turns out to be a bit of a detriment in another way, because the muscles are confined within the exoskeleton. There's a limit to how big the muscles can be and how powerful they can get because they're confined within the exoskeleton. And the exoskeleton is also extremely adaptable. Now, the big disadvantage, the drawback to having an exoskeleton is, first off, they tend to be brittle. Right? So in most of the arthropods, we're going to be talking about chitin as the substance that makes up the bulk of the exoskeleton. In the case of the crustaceans, it's going to be calcium carbonate. So the same stuff that we saw making up the coral reef is the stuff that makes up the exoskeleton if you're a crustacean. Both of those two things are fairly strong, but they're also fairly brittle. And the downside to both chitin and calcium carbonate is that they're non-living materials, so that if an arthropod has an injury to its exoskeleton, that is a permanent situation. That is not going to heal because it's non-living material. So if there's a breakage, if there's a crack, if there's something, a flaw with the exoskeleton, that's going to be a really, really big problem if you're an arthropod. Lots and lots of just insects, not even the other arthropods, but just insects. A lot of them alive right now. That works out to about 200 million insects per person on the planet, which is kind of a humbling thought. There's actually over 1 million described species, and very likely there's probably 5 or 10 million total species out there by the time all is said and done. Very, very important for us. I mean, we could go into tons and tons of economic importance, from those that pollinate our crops to those that damage structures like termites. You could go on for a few hours about some of the ways that even just the insects, much less the chelicerates, crustaceans, and not so much myriapods, but the others, how they affect us in terms of everyday life. One of the big things we talked about previously with the nematodes was the fact that they tend to go through ecdysis. And if you remember, ecdysis is that process of shedding the outer covering or getting rid of the old skin to grow a new one. Arthropods are the same way, right? They have a non-living outer covering, which again, indeed very protective, but also non-living, non-stretchy, and doesn't grow. So therefore, if they're going to grow, they have to get rid of the old and grow a new one. And that actually is a fairly difficult process to get through if you're an arthropod. A lot of arthropods have compound eyes. We see that a lot with some of the more advanced insects. Compound eyes are made up of individual lenses called ommatidia that are all connected to the optic nerve and eventually allow the insect, in this case, to perceive its world visually around it. Interestingly, both compound eyes don't necessarily have to have the same number of ommatidia. That's actually controlled independently, but both of them are going to give a very, very good and fairly clear picture of the world around the insect. Now, not all insects, not all arthropods, have compound eyes with ommatidia. Some of them have simpler eyes, especially the more primitive species, but those also work pretty well for what they need to do. Ocelli are the simple eyes, and so even on the top of this ant's head here, there are 3 ocelli. Ocellus is singular, ocelli is plural, and these are essentially a single lens, which is at best able to give this insect a perception of what is the light intensity above it. So, for example, they could kind of determine what time of day it is based on light intensity using those ocelli on the top of their head. And like this ant, a lot of insects have both compound eyes and ocelli. Most insects have ocelli, but not all insects have the compound eyes. In terms of circulatory system, arthropods, as far as I know, without exception, have an open circulatory system, which is one of the other factors that limits how big they can get. They don't have much of a coelom. That's been reduced over evolutionary time, so the space within the body where fluid has to circulate is actually relatively small. Open circulatory system again contains hemolymph, which is going to be able to do a number of things, not only delivering gases and nutrients and waste, but also in general just moving other substances, even like hormones, around inside the body for these organisms. This is a scanning electron micrograph of the ocelli, the simple eyes, on the top of the head of an insect. So again, just a single lens with a light-sensitive core, which allows the insect to perceive time of day. Compound eyes are made up of these many, many ommatidia, so individual one like this, sort of like a hexagon. And also in this case, there are little tactile receptors. So this insect is actually able to feel with its eyes as well. And these tactile receptors also help to protect the individual ommatidia as well. And again, the compound eyes only show up in the more advanced insects, which when I say that, really most of the insects that most of us are familiar with are advanced insects, right? The really primitive ones, unless you've taken a class in entomology, which is the study of insects, you probably have never heard of many of the other groups. So, springtails and thrips and firebrats and those kinds of things are things that most people don't have in their vocabulary. Those are primitive insects. And for the most part, many of them only have the simple eyes, whereas, things like dragonflies or grasshoppers or beetles or flies or wasps or butterflies, all of those guys, for the most part, have compound eyes. And they may have ocelli as well, but they, for the most part, have compound eyes. Dragonflies have some of the biggest eyes relative to their body size in the entire animal world, which makes sense because what do? They fly around in the air and they catch other little flying insects. You need to have a lot of really good visual eyesight to do that. Their eyes actually touch on the back of their head and almost touch on the underside of their head. So they nearly have 360 degrees vision around their head, which makes it really, really helpful for finding and spotting and catching those flying insect prey. In terms of a nervous system, we have a really, again, kind of a decentralized nervous system. There's not really a brain per se. There's a cerebral ganglion, kind of like we saw back when we covered the flatworms. And there are chains of ganglia that run down the body. Essentially, each segment of the animal's body is going to have a pair of ganglia, one for the left side, one for the right side. And I don't really have this on a slide, but an insect body in particular is made up of 3 main segments. There's a head, there's a thorax, and there's an abdomen. But what is a little bit less obvious is that each one of those is also made up of smaller segments. Now, the head and thorax are a little bit tricky because sometimes those segments are fused, especially in the head. But the thorax, usually, and the abdomen, almost always, you can actually spot the individual segments so that, if you think about the head of an insect, it might have 5 or 6 fused segments that looks like a single big segment. The thorax is almost always 3 segments in an insect, and the abdomen can be anywhere from 9 to 13 segments. Every single one of those segments is going to have a pair of ganglia in it. And again, a ganglion is just a collection of neurons that help to control that particular part of the body. Just in general terms, the head of an insect in particular is used to perceive the world around it, so it's sensory, and it's also feeding, right? So it's how they get their nutrition is in through the head as well. The thorax of an insect is used for movement. So typically, in most insects, especially the advanced ones, like I said before, each thoracic segment is going to have a pair of legs. So three times two, three segments times two legs per segment is six legs total. And the second two segments are each going to have a pair of wings in most advanced insects. Now, that's a bit more variable. So, for example, flies like mosquitoes and houseflies and those kinds of things, they only have two wings because the second pair of wings is modified into a different kind of a structure. But most insects, the ones that we're familiar with, are going to have two pairs of wings, one pair attached to the second and one pair attached to the third segment of the thorax. The abdomen of an insect is almost everything else the insect is going to do. So it's respiration, it's circulation, it's osmoregulation, it's reproduction, it's digestion, it's everything else the animal has to do except for feeding, sensory, and movement. Everything else is taken care of by thoracic segments. Now, when we start talking about other arthropods like crustaceans and chelicerates and the myriapods, they're different, right? They have different numbers of segments that do different kinds of things. And we'll talk about those a little bit, but really our focus for the arthropods is going to be on the insects. In terms of respiration, and this is respiration like ventilation, inhalation, exhalation, that kind of respiration, not cellular level respiration. It varies, right? So, for example, the insects are going to use what are called trachea. This picture here is a picture of what's called a spiracle, which is the openable, closable part that leads into the trachea on the inside of the segment. The trachea is basically a tube which then branches into smaller and smaller and smaller tubes in the segment called tracheoles, which allow the insect to disperse gases to and from its cells. So the spiracle leads into the trachea if you're an insect. Now, if you're an aquatic insect, which by the way, there aren't very many at all truly aquatic insects, and we'll get into why that is a bit later on, they do different things. They still typically have trachea and spiracles, but they use them differently than what they do on land. If you're dealing with crustaceans, which are mostly aquatic, they're going to have gills. And if you're dealing with chelicerates, and by the way, chelicerates are things like spiders, ticks, mites, scorpion, and a few other things. They have what are called book lungs, which are, think about almost like a terrestrial gill. They are very, very thin flaps of tissue that are stacked very close together, like pages in a book, hence the name book lungs, that they use to extract oxygen and put CO2 into the air. So different kind of a structure there. And myriapods are even more variable than that. So respiration is extremely variable within the arthropod group. All right. Now, Malpighian tubules are the excretory structures that we see. So in an insect, for example, these structures, and again, when I say excretion, think osmoregulation, maintaining water balance, and getting rid of nitrogenous waste like ammonia or uric acid. They use their Malpighian tubules to extract those wastes from their body, dump out those wastes into the intestine, and from there, of course, the intestine leads out of the body, and that's how they get rid of their metabolic waste. So that's a fairly common strategy in the arthropods as well, something unique to this group. So this is a better look at those trachea that I was talking about. So if you imagine this picture back here, right, so the spiracle, this is like a head-on view of the spiracle. If you look at the spiracle head-on here, this is what you're seeing here. Once you get through the spiracle, there is a tube called the trachea that leads into smaller and smaller and smaller tracheoles, and eventually around these tracheoles, those are the individual cells of this grasshopper that need oxygen and produce CO2. This is the gas distribution system if you are an arthropod. Now, if you're a mammal, we have alveoli, little air sacs which help disperse air to our cells and get waste gases away from our cells. So it's a different kind of a structure, but it's the same basic idea, right? It's a huge amount of surface area set up to do gas exchange with cells of the body. In this case, it's more decentralized, right? There are spiracles and trachea on almost every section, versus in mammals or birds where the respiratory system is much more focused and centralized in one part of the body. But it does the same thing. There's no one right way to do any of these things, and that's really a common theme throughout this chapter. Not much to say on the outside parts here. I talked about the head, thorax, and abdomen. We'll talk more about some of these other structures when we get to insects specifically. On the inside, we have, there's a brain, which is a really, I use that term loosely with insects, more of a cerebral ganglion here. There's a crop, which is, it's like a first stomach almost. A crop is where food goes in, but it can also come back out of it if it needs to. So birds, for example, also have a crop, and when a mama bird is feeding a baby bird, the food that comes out is coming from the crop. It's not coming from the stomach. In birds, once food goes into the stomach, it can't come back out again. But if it goes into the crop, then they can regurgitate that and use it to feed their young, for example. This grasshopper has gastric ceca, which are little chambers where fermentation takes place to help them break down cellulose, which is a notoriously difficult thing to digest. But these ceca give more time for the food to get broken down. There's then a stomach where food is more thoroughly digested. Here are those Mapivian tubules that are involved in excretion and osmoregulation. There's, in this case, female variety of ovaries here. There is an aorta with a series of hearts, right? Hearts for basically each segment moving from the thorax back to the abdomen. There are ganglia in segments as well. And so it's a lot of what we talked about already is shown there in that cross section, or that longitudinal section of that grasshopper. All right, so what we're going to do here is we're going to go through the myriapods next, and then what I'll probably do is I'll cut off this section and we'll start up section 4, talking about the crustaceans next, I believe. So the myriapods, this is our first class now of the phylum Arthropoda. And so myriapod, the name actually means literally lots of legs. If you have a myriad of something, you have a whole lot of legs. And pod always refers to foot. So myriapod literally means lots of feet. The chylopods and diplopods are the two orders within this group. So Chilopoda, Diplopoda. Chylopods are centipedes and diplopods are millipedes. So a couple things that are kind of consistent between these two groups. Both chylopods and diplopods have the state of being dioecious. They're separate male and female. They both do internal fertilization because they're terrestrial exclusively. And again, as we've seen, external fertilization does not work on land because gametes tend to dry out. They are going to lay eggs. Myriapods do not give birth to live young, as we're going to see in some upcoming groups here before too long. There are some different strategies aside from just laying eggs. Of course, our own species doesn't lay eggs, at least most of us. So in this case, we are still dealing with an oviparous species. Oviparous means that a female lays her eggs and they hatch outside the body. Usually the female never sees them again. And so we see that with a lot of other animals as well. But before too long, we're going to start getting into some other strategies, aside from just being oviparous. One of the other cool things about myriapods is they tend to, as they grow, as they age, they actually add new segments to their body as they get older. So they actually get longer as they get older as well. One of the really big distinguishing factors morphologically between centipedes and millipedes is the number of number of legs per segment. So if we look at the centipede here, if we just pick out a segment, so like this segment right here. This segment right here has a pair of legs attached to it. There's 2 legs on this segment, so that's a single pair of legs on that segment. Centipedes always have 1 pair of legs per segment. Diplopods, on the other hand, always have 2 pairs of legs per segment. So if we look at this segment right here, so this is this orange and black right here. That is a segment, and this segment has 2 legs on the right side, and there are 2 legs on the left side as well. So there are 2 pairs of legs per segment if you're a millipede. In other words, if you're a centipede, you have 2 legs per segment. If you're a millipede, you have 4 legs per segment. So the other, distinguishing way you can tell a millipede from a centipede behaviorally is by the speed at which they move. So centipedes always tend to be really fast. If you flip over a rock or turn over a log and something scurries away and it has lots of legs, it was a centipede. If you flip over that log or that rock, and there's this multi-leg thing just kind of hanging out, doesn't really care that you're there, just sort of sits there, chances are that's a millipede. Millipedes tend to be kind of slow and steady. They never move very fast at all. They're just kind of like going to plug along and do their thing. They're more of an armor versus speed versus the centipedes, which are more speed over armor. So it's kind of different strategies there. Centipedes are less numerous in terms of species. There's about 2,500 species. Millipedes, as we're going to see, there's about 10,000 species. And a lot of that really has to do with their ecological niche, their role in nature. Centipedes are predatory, and we always find fewer predators than we do herbivores or detritivores in a food chain. There's simply less food to support the predators than there are different types of food to support herbivores or detritivores. So centipedes are about 1/4 the diversity of the millipedes, and that in large part has to do with the fact that they require live prey. Millipedes, they feed on dead stuff, and there's plenty of dead stuff out there to eat. Not only is there plenty of it, it also doesn't move very fast, so millipedes don't have to be very fast to capture their prey. Centipedes are predatory. Their prey is moving around. They have to be fast to catch their prey, so they're going to be much more of a fast mover than millipedes are. Centipedes can also be venomous. There are some really, really nasty bites that centipedes can deliver in some parts, tropical parts of the world, some really large centipedes as well. But, we don't have those in this part of the world. And you probably have to try pretty hard to get bitten by one. They're certainly not coming after you to bite you in any sort of a way. If you happen to stick your hand in the wrong crack or crevice and there's a centipede there, yeah, it might tear into you. But for the most part, they're not looking to bite anybody. They're just out there doing their thing, and they're not trying to bite people. They have no reason to. Diplopods, again, are millipedes. 2 pairs of legs per segment. These are scavengers or detritivores. They feed on dead leaf litter, dead plant matter. They are that first round of breaking dead stuff down in the environment, as we saw before when I talked about detritivores versus decomposers. Their habitat tends to be under, logs and rocks and those kinds of things where they can find that dead plant matter to consume. Millipedes, not only do they have armor, some of them can also secrete a fairly distasteful substance called hydrogen cyanide, which sounds awful. It's not as bad as it sounds, actually. It's just sort of a bad smelling substance that is going to make a predator think twice before it decides to finally eat a millipede, because it smells kind of nasty. So it's not really that toxic, it just tastes kind of bad, and so predators therefore tend to leave millipedes alone for the most part. So with that, we're going to move into the crustacea, and the crustacea are going to start off our 4th section on the coelomate invertebrates. It's a bit too much to cover at the end of the 3rd section, so we're going to start up with a new one here in a second, and we'll start talking about some crustaceans next.